Dysgraphia. It's kind of a dreaded word. Parents don't like hearing it, and teachers don't like hearing it, and really neither do clinicians. And I think part of the reason why is that there's a lot of different underlying things that can contribute to dysgraphia. So we get the diagnosis of dysgraphia, and it's like, oh man, like now what? So what is dysgraphia? So dys means bad or wrong, and graphia means writing. So basically it's difficulty with writing. It's poor writing. You know, it's kind of the flip side in some ways of dyslexia, which is like poor reading. But there's a lot of pieces that go in. So there's kind of 4 different categories of dysgraphia that we can explore, and 4 different things that can be the underlying difficulty. And of course there can be overlap. You can have difficulty across a lot of these different modalities, which is where things really do get complex. So where to jump in? I guess the one I'm most interested in is quite often if you have dyslexia, there's also going to be a problem in writing and in spelling. And in dyslexia, you can't figure out how the sounds of our spoken language match the letters of our written language. So you're going to have a problem reading because you're not recognizing words. So when you see a word on the page, you can't figure out what sounds those letters represent and how those sounds go together, and basically what word you should be hearing in your brain when you're looking at that letter or that word on the page. Similarly, when it comes time to spell and to write, you can't figure out how to spell it, or else you're expending an awful lot of processing trying to figure that out. It's like, okay, I want to write this word. What letter do I need? Which order do those letters go in? That doesn't look right. How do I spell this? So you get really bogged down in your writing process because your spelling is really poor. And then we also will see some impacts in the language too. Usually when there's dyslexia, we'll see things like missing grammar words. We might have missing suffixes like past tense ed or ing on words, or we'll find that words like is, was, at, to, some of those smaller grammar words often get chopped out, so then our sentences are agrammatical or our sentence constructions are kind of poor. We'll see that show up in dyslexia too as part of the underlying language disorder that's there. So sometimes what we see is kids with dyslexia are adequate readers because reading is like recognition. So it's like a multiple choice test. You see a word and you can figure out what it is and you can read it okay. And so sometimes these kids are reading just a little bit below grade level and they kind of slip under the radar. But then when it comes time to write, their writing is poor and their spelling is atrocious. And this is still dyslexia. It's just that the reading part of their dyslexia has gotten a little bit stronger because they have some compensatory skills basically that they can access. But then when it comes time to spell, there's nothing to draw from and the spelling really falls apart. So spelling is always a red flag of an underlying language disorder, and it's always a red flag of something like dyslexia that's happening. And a lot of people don't get too excited about spelling, and they should. Clinically, it's a red flag. It's a clinical marker that there's an underlying disorder that we can address. It's a skill-based problem that we can fix with therapy. So that's kind of the first and maybe the most classic type of problem that will show up in dysgraphia, and it's the one that I work with the most often and I'm most interested in. We can also see problems in visual perception. So sometimes we have kids who have difficulty figuring out the spacing between letters. They have difficulty figuring out how to fit letters between the lines or on the lines. You may see some wonky stuff going on around the margins where they're maybe, they're indenting too far in, or they're not writing to the end of the page, or they're almost writing right off the page. So sometimes kids have a lot of trouble figuring out how to operate within that visual field. And so visual perceptual deficits can show up. And quite often those are best assessed by an occupational therapist, and probably best addressed by some of the therapies that an occupational therapist has as well. But when there's stuff going on in that visual perceptual field within the task of writing, it just gets hard to put the words that they're thinking of down onto the paper. We can also see physically getting things down onto the paper shows up when there's some difficulties in the motor planning and motor execution. So we might see some problems with motor planning, and we might see problems with fine motor. And quite often these kids will have really poor letter formation, or the letters that they form won't be formed appropriately. They won't look right. These kids too may also go off the lines or not fit things well within the lines. Quite often fine motor difficulties will interact with visual perceptual difficulties. We often will see kids have difficulty with things like crossing the midline, where they're only writing and using sort of one plane of their body, and as they're adjusting their body with the page, these kids will often be writing maybe with some really large indents, and they'll use spacing on the page kind of in a funny way, and they'll have difficulty crossing their body and writing with the right hand, starting on the left side of the page and then moving smoothly across the page. And there's a few different things that we can see as symptoms of difficulty with midline crossing. And usually it'll show up if you watch a kid write for a little while. And then again, motor planning, fine motor control, and things like midline crossing, best addressed probably by an occupational therapist. Really worth getting that assessment done and then integrating some of those therapy tips and tools and techniques into the process of writing, or maybe doing some fine motor work outside of writing and then applying that to things like pencil grip and letter formation and some of that kind of stuff. So visual motor problems and graphomotor problems and fine motor control and some of those kinds of things definitely can cause dysgraphia when the language system is relatively intact. So I'm classifying that as 3 categories now. We have dyslexia or dysgraphia, which is based on a language disorder. We've got visual perceptual problems, and then we've got graphomotor problems or motor control problems. We've got 3 separate categories now of dysgraphia. And then the last one would be executive control. So writing is a massive, massive processing task, and it really, really strains the working memory system. So if you've got any difficulties in attention and working memory and processing speed and some of those things in the cognitive profile, these are classically the problems that we'll see, or the difficulties that we'll see arise in ADHD. That executive control system can also cause difficulties with writing. And basically with writing, we're trying to keep so many balls in the air. What am I trying to say? What word do I want to use? How does what I'm trying to say link to what I said in the last sentence so that there's organization in my writing? What parts of this do I need to capitalize? How do I use punctuation? How do I spell that again? How do I form this letter? There are so many pieces that need to be coordinated that the working memory really will just bottom out. And if you add in there difficulties with inhibition, then while you're trying to write, the kid next to you is making sounds and you lift your head up and turn to see what he's doing, and now you can't remember where you were on the page or what you were saying. The fluorescent lights start buzzing, so then you look up to check out what that sound is, and now you're off track and you can't get back on. You break the lead on your pencil, you decide you need a drink of water. The attention and the difficulties inhibiting paying attention to those other distractors really then gets in the way of writing, especially in a busy classroom environment. So basically we've got 4 things that can show up and cause dysgraphia. We've got the executive motor control problems with attention and working memory processing speed. We've got the visual perceptual difficulties. We've got the graphomotor motor control problems, as well as a language-based disorder. And quite often these things do co-occur. So you can have any mix of all 4 of those things happening. And that's often what is going on when we look at pretty severe writing problems. There often is a difficulty in all 4 of those areas. And that's why assessment is so important. It's like, oh, well, we're having difficulty with writing. It's like, yeah, I get that, but what's underlying it? And which strategies are going to be most effective? And then which therapy do we need to implement? And sometimes which strategies do we need to bring into therapy? As far as just internal regulation and sensory regulation, or preparing materials and getting ready to write, or maybe doing some priming around organizing your thoughts and having some templates pre-writing drafted out to alleviate some of that working memory and some of the language formulation and organization pieces. So writing is a super complex behavior, and it's kind of where everything comes together, and it's often where kids are having a lot of difficulty, and it really is a place for some multidisciplinary work and assessment as well to put it all together. Anyway, that's your mini lesson on dysgraphia for today. I hope you find it helpful. And I hope if your child is having any difficulty with writing, you consider connecting with somebody who's got some insight as to what writing requires. And to really get to the root of it, you may be looking at getting a psychological evaluation done, an occupational therapist assessment done, and a language assessment done. And if you have problems with spelling, particularly, that's where I get really interested, because there is a language disorder that will be underlying that spelling difficulty. So any difficulty with spelling is a red flag, and that's what I'm up to. And I integrate some of the motor control and visual processing pieces, as well as managing attention and working memory within my therapy. I'm by no means an expert on it, and I'm always looking for more, but we also have a growing network here in Calgary of people that we can refer out to and get some of those assessments completed where appropriate. So if you have concerns, get in touch. I'd love to speak with you and see if we're an appropriate fit, or see if we can help you out. And my name is Trent. My company is Speak to Read. You can find me on the interwebs, as they say. And if you need my support, reach out. I'm around. Take care. Bye.